welcome back to part 5 of our chat app series. In the last part, we took a look at hooking up Firebase and actually using Firebase Authentication to be able to create accounts over here. So if we go to our Firebase dashboard and click on Authentication, you'll see we have our user here that we created last time. But the thing we didn't do correctly is over here in our simulator, if we have a logged in session, we don't want to show this login and register form. So we are going to now handle that properly, as well as make sure that we are inserting to our database the user's first name and last name. So here we're simply using their email and password. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to hit this and we're going to say delete account. It's going to have us confirm. Let's go ahead and delete this user. And we are going to look at setting up the database as well as some other cosmetic fixes. So let's go ahead and open up our project and make sure you open up that workspace and not the Xcode proj. You want the XC workspace. And if you recall, the workspace includes the CocoaPods. And the other thing I want to call out here, which is the other tab I had open, is if you head on over to developer.apple.com and click on the design tab up here, you'll see this. So if you're not familiar, SF symbols stands for San Francisco symbols, and it's this iconography standard that Apple came out with for iOS 13 that basically allows you to use a bunch of system icons in your app. So you can go ahead and download the application here. It's a Mac app, and you can actually let's open up SF symbols. And in here, you'll see there are a ton of symbols that we can use, and I'm going to be leveraging them throughout the course of this series. So I wanted to share this before I just assumed that everyone had used it. The other thing I want to mention is, if you recall, on our registration screen, I wasn't too happy with the way this looked. So I was going through this actually yesterday, and I realized that there is a circular version of this already called person.circle, and there's a filled-in version as well. So first and foremost, let's go back to our register view controller, and let's find that person and make it person.circle, just so that looks a little nicer. And go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. Hopefully we're on the right simulator. Looks like we are not. Let's close this. I'm not sure why it always likes to default to that simulator, but let's go ahead and pick that iPhone 11 Pro Max and hit build one more time. And we should see that that image looks nicer. So give it a second. Simulator loves to be slow when I do these videos. Any day, there it goes. Cool. So now we can see this looks a lot nicer, and it's more in line with the circular avatar look that we want to give it. So that is FS symbols. So good application to have, very lightweight. Apple did all the heavy lifting of designing these super nice looking graphics, fully dark mode supportive, and all that good stuff. So let's close this and get back to Firebase. So again, the first thing, if you recall, here we need to handle the user authentication state. So when someone signs in, we want to get rid of this whole screen, and we want to not show login again when they open up the app. So if we go to the conversation view controller, which is the root controller that gets instantiated when our app launches, and if you think back to the very beginning of this series, we wanted to use user defaults to figure out if we should show this screen or not, which is the login controller nested in a navigation controller. So instead of using that user defaults, what we want to do is import Firebase auth, and we want to check the authentication state off of this. So go ahead and get rid of that. And what I'm going to do is create another function in here and call it validate auth. And let's go ahead and paste that back in there, but let's fix our curly braces. And we're going to call this validate auth in view did appear. And obviously we no longer have this variable, but what we want to check is if on Firebase auth, the auth .auth.current user is nil. So if the current user property is nil, we're going to show this login view controller. This current user will get set automatically when you instantiate Firebase auth and log a user in. So this will actually handle the appropriate use case for our authentication. So go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And actually, one more thing we should probably do, if you head on over to the login view controller and find that authentication function where we're actually signing the user in, and what we want to do, so this function in this case, what we want to do in this case is once this succeeds, if it succeeds, we want to dismiss this navigation controller. And the way we can do that is by calling dismiss. Pretty straightforward. Make sure that you put a weak self over here so we don't cause a retention cycle. And we can unwrap that weak self as well to be a strong self. So we can say guardlet strong self is self. Let's put a return. Let's fix that else. And what we want to say here is strong self dot navigation controller dismiss. Now, I don't recall if we need to call dismiss on the nav controller or this current controller. I believe it's the navigation, but we'll find out if this crashes in just a second anyways. So that's good enough for me. And let's also put this in the registration controller once the user successfully registers. Firebase will automatically log that user in as well. So let's put that there. Let's bring in weak self over here before this, like so. And then let's also bind this optional with a guard let. And if you don't recall, this weak self business just ensures that we capture a weakly retained reference of self, which is this class. If you don't include this and just reference self here, functionally your code will still work, but you'll have a memory leak. And I might do a completely separate video to this series about memory leaks. It's a very important topic, but nonetheless, make sure you include weak self. And let's go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And you see actually that we're on our red screen, which is a conversation screen, and we're not even presenting that login form. And the reason is because from our last video, I haven't reset the simulator yet, and I think it has our last user cached in the logged in state. So go ahead and delete that app from your simulator, and we might need to reset it also, but as a sanity check, let me just read this again. So we're saying if the current user is nil, we want to present login, which looks good to me. So let's go and in our toolbar, after you select the simulator, hit this drop down, and we want to erase the simulator. This will purge all the caches and anything that Firebase has stored. Even if you delete the app, the reason it doesn't go away is because that storage is occurring under the hood in Keychain, which is agnostic of a app sandbox. So you have to reset the simulator. So while it's doing this, let's take a look at the database over here. So under this, we want to select database. And when we register a new user, we want to do two things. Well, we want to do a lot of things, but for the purposes of this video, we want to do two things. We want to ensure that the email that the user is trying to register with is not priorly existing, so it doesn't belong to a user that already has signed up. And then we also want to make an insertion into the database. So before we can do any of that, we need to set up the database. And we're going to do that by clicking that button you just saw. We're going to start with a test instead of a production database. We're going to continue. And let's see, what does it want here? It wants the region. We're going to continue. We don't really care. Let that do its thing. Over here, looks like this reset finally. Hit Command R to build and run. And we should get our login screen this time. There we go. So now let's go ahead and actually create a user account. So I'm going to again do joe@gmail.com and password. And when we hit this, you'll see that we dismiss that screen because we have successfully created Joe's account and Joe is now signed in. And if I stop running the app and again hit that run button, you see now that we stay on this conversation view controller. In other words, this will be the screen where we see all of our chats, and we no longer show that login screen because we already know Joe is signed in and we don't want Joe to have to sign in every time. Cool, so that is persistence of authentication session. Looks like our database over here is set up. And now we can simply read and write to the database. So 2 things I want to clarify. The Firebase database has 2 aspects of it. There are documents you can store, which we won't look at in this video, and there is a real-time NoSQL database. So if you come up here, you can see that there is this dropdown, and what we care about in this video is the database. And like I said, this is a NoSQL database, which means it's not relational, there's no tables and rows, it's basically just a JSON dump where we can put data. And this is a point that a lot of people get confused about because you kind of have to design your data scheme and your models without any rules. So we're going to do that in this video, and we're going to, over the course of this series, learn how to optimize and save cost and all that jazz. So the first thing you want to do is after you've selected the database in these tabs, go to Rules, and under Rules, you'll notice that the read and write is set to false for security reasons. So go ahead and set this to true, and set this to true as well. And basically, this will allow anybody to read and write to your database. And essentially, we're gonna be extending these rules later on to make sure that only authenticated users can read and write once we move this to production. So once you have done that, we want to save the changes by coming up here and dismissing this first of all, rather coming up here and clicking publish. This has published our database changes, and now we should be able to read and write to this NoSQL database, and we'll see our entries come in over here. So let's go to our code and design a way to read and write to the database. So once again, I am going to, rather before we reset the simulator, let's create the object that can actually read and write. So we could have the database read and write in each view controller, but the issue with that is we're going to get a bunch of redundant code pretty quickly. So what I like to do is create a dedicated object, and we're going to put it in resources. It'll be a Swift file, and I like to call this object database manager. And basically, we're going to design a public API on this, so public functions that allow us to seamlessly perform operations on the database, regardless of which view controller we're in. So you can imagine in the chat view controller, we're going to want to pull all the messages. In the conversation, we want to pull the conversations, all that good stuff. So let's start by importing Firebase database. And if you recall, when we installed CocoaPods for just Firebase core dependencies, we also brought in the database CocoaPod. We're going to create a final class, final basically notating that this class cannot be subclassed, called database manager. And we want this class to be a singleton just for easy read and write access. So we're going to create a static constant property on here called shared. And this will return an instance of database manager. We also want a reference to the database, but we're going to make it private so nobody can pull this property externally. And this will be database. And it is, I believe, called, I think it's just database, might be there it is, database.database.reference. And let's just create a very, very simple write function, which will insert some data to our database so y'all can see what that looks like. So let's create a public func called test. And we are going to say database.child. We want the lowercase database, which is our property. And we want to say child And let's just call this foo. And I think it's set value. There it is. So basically the way, like I mentioned, a database, a NoSQL database works is it's JSON. So JSON is keys and objects. So the child here refers to a key that we want to write data to. So we said foo. And in JSON, we can basically point it to anything that normal JSON supports. So we can put a string as the value for this key. So it can be something like that, or we can do another object like this. So you can imagine the case of users, we probably want a key that's the user's email address. And in here, we want to hold their first name, last name, their profile picture URL, and all the other good stuff. But before we do that, let's just note that this accepts any optional. So we could in fact pass in nil, and this will delete the value if a foo key exists. Or what we can do is we can pass in, like I mentioned, a dictionary, which is a string, and let's just pass in true here because we can have that in our JSON as well. And in our conversation view controller, once the view loads, let's just call that function, and we should see over here that the data gets inserted. So let's head on to our conversation view controller, and we're going to say database manager, if I can spell today, dot shared, which is that singleton, and we have this function called test. So let's simply do that. And if we hit Command R to build and run, while it's doing that, I'm just going to come on over here, and this should update real time like that. So I really like how Google made this update real time as data is written. It kind of just looks really cool, and it's also very easy to help visualize what's really going on. So you saw once the app launched over there, because in view did load, we called that function. We have foo, and it points to another object, which is this dictionary, with a key of something and a value of true. So that's how we are going to insert data. So I'm going to select this and hit this X to delete this entry and confirm that there. And there it goes away. And what we actually want to do is insert a user once someone creates an account. So go back to your database manager, and let's go ahead and create a function called, a public function rather, called insert user with user, and this will be a chat app user object. So let's go ahead and create this object, which will be a struct, which just wraps all the values that we want to insert. So we're going to say let first name, let last name, let email address, and we don't really need to store the password, and it's also really not good practice to store it, especially unencrypted. So we're going to omit that password. So we only are going to deal with these three for now. Once we get to the lesson about uploading photos, we're also going to include a profile picture URL, which will actually be a URL. Rather, it could be a string that points to it, but let's just comment that out. We'll leave it here just so we can remember we need to do this. And once this function is called, we are simply going to insert into the database a child with the user.email address, and we're going to set a value, and that value will be as follows. It will be first name, and this will be user.firstname. Last name, this will be user.lastname. And there's no reason to put the email address in here as another key, because the key of this actually, of this user is in fact the email address itself, so it would be redundant. So the thing that is important to understand here is the unique thing that we are delimiting users based on is their email. So there cannot be a user, two users with the same address. So let's go ahead and go to our register view controller. And what we're going to do is before we create this account, rather once we create this account, we are going to call this database manager. So in here, once this succeeds, let's get rid of this. We're going to say database manager dot shared dot insert user, and we want to provide a chat app user object here, and we'll open up the constructor for this, and the first name is first name, and if you recall, we unwrapped all of the text field data here. So first name is first name, last name, and email. So this will do the database entry. And the other thing that I mentioned, we don't want users to have redundant accounts with the same email. So we want to make sure that this email does not already exist. So we're going to go back to the database manager and do that in a second. Here we have a warning saying we're not using this user or result object. So I'm going to instead change this to say auth result doesn't equal nil, since we don't really care about the result object itself. Let's go back to the database manager. And what else? The other thing I'm going to do is create an extension on this database manager just to organize our code a little bit. What we can do is we can add a mark comment here and call this account management. And this one is a insert query. So another thing you can do, which is cool and it's often done in professional projects, is with 3 slashes, you can add a documentation string. So whenever you call this function, the autocomplete will show this. So insert new user to database. And then the other function that you want to add in here is a function that validates the email that you are trying to use for the new user does not exist already. So we're going to say public func validate new user with email, and this is going to return a boolean. Whoops. Rather, instead of returning a boolean, what we're going to do is we're going to have a completion handler, because the function to actually get data out of the database is asynchronous. So we need a completion block, and this will be an @escaping completion block, and it's going to return to us a boolean based on if the validation passed. So this will return true if the user email does not exist, and false if it does exist. And maybe we can name this function better. Let's call this email or user exists with email. So this should, if this returns true, then we cannot use the email, otherwise we can. I think this name is probably a little more indicative of what we are trying to do. So how do we actually get data out of the database? The important other piece. We're simply going to say database, and we're going to pass, let's see, what's the problem here? It's not auto-completing. This is void. Let's go ahead and hit Command B. And it looks like we have an error somewhere, so let me zoom out. Let's see. We have an extension here. This property here we're calling database.database. Shouldn't be an issue. And I think it's because it's private. Still not an issue. Let's look at the error. So the error is saying ambiguous use of reference. So I think it's complaining because of our extension. So let's just get rid of the extension for now, for the sake of time, and we will fix this in another video. So hit Command B, and it's still wanting to complain. So let's figure out what the heck we just broke. So let me comment this out. Hit Command B, and we're still breaking. Great. Okay, let's see what happened. So we're saying database.database. Let's try that again. Database.database.reference. Oh, I see. I think I accidentally deleted the parens at the end of this. Okay. In that case, let's just do that extension again. So let me uncomment this. And let's do an extension on the database manager. And let's close this here. Control I to fix that indentation. Add that mark again. And account management. So I probably will never edit out these errors that I hit myself and things I break. I think they're super helpful in terms of learning. So I apologize if they're slightly annoying of me hitting errors along the way, but you're gonna get them either way. So okay, actually getting data. So Firebase database allows you to observe value changes on any entry in your NoSQL database by specifying the child that you want to observe for and specifying what type of observation you want. So we only want to observe a single event, which in other words is basically query the database once. So we're going to say child, and the child is going to be the email, and we're going to say observe single event, and I believe we want this one. We want to get its value, and it's going to return a snapshot. I believe, yes. Okay, it's a snapshot. And this snapshot has a value property off of it that can be optional if it doesn't exist. So we're going to say guard let value equals snapshot dot value, and notice it's any optional. So we want to cast it to be a string. So basically we are trying to say in this snapshot, if the value is a string, assign it to this, and let's call this email. And if it's able to do this, that means this email exists already. And let me actually change this to found email so it doesn't collide with this variable. And if we have an email that is found, we can simply call the completion handler and pass in true. So the caller will now know, hey, this email exists already, we can't proceed. So let's show the user an error. Otherwise, if we can't find it, we're going to say completion false. So this email does not exist, aka go ahead and create this account. You'll get a warning here because we're not actually using this once again. So let's go ahead and say this, instead of doing guardlet, what you can do is this doesn't equal nil, which essentially checks the same thing instead of binding it to a constant property. So let's go ahead and integrate this piece into our registration form. So again, what did we call this? We call this user exists with email. So go to your registration form, which is the register view controller, and we want to call this function before we do any of this registration jazz. So we are going to say database manager shared and user exists with, and the email is the email string from up above, and the completion will be a boolean in. So we're going to say if the user exists, we're going to stop and show an error, otherwise we'll continue. So we'll say guard, and we don't want the user to exists, otherwise we're going to return, and we're also going to show an error. User already exists. And if we can continue, we can move all of this stuff into here. And we should be able to hit Command B and build by just moving it all. And let's make this function a little more customizable by using parameters for this message. So we're gonna make this a message param, and again, this is the function that shows a alert with an error, and the message will be a string, and the default value will be the string that we had before, but now we can pass in a message of our own. So what we can do now is call this function in this return, and we can say Hopefully, does that look good? Whoops, I lied. We don't want it in this one. We want it in this one. Like so. And this again will cause a memory retention cycle. So do a weak self, make this optional. And what we can do is actually we can put this strong self unwrap up here, use strong self to call this, and we can remove the weak self over here because we are already unwrapping it up above to be strong self. Let's get rid of this line break and let's put in a sensible message. So looks like a user account for that email address already exists. So we should be good to test this now. So if you recall, we created a Joe account over here. I think we deleted it. Looks like we made it again. But once we try to create a Joe account this time, it actually won't work because we have not inserted Joe into the database. So what we want to do is reset the simulator and also delete this account. We're going to do this from a clean slate, just so all of our pieces line up. So delete that from authentication. Make sure your database over here is empty. I am not sure why it goes back to Firestore by default. It's kind of annoying, but make sure you switch to your database here and on your simulator. Select it, and let's go ahead and erase its contents, which will just reset it and purge the cache. That's what we want. Confirm. And while it's doing that, I am going to make sure it just crashed because we reset the simulator, so it's not a real crash, it's just Xcode complaining because it doesn't know what happened. But while that's going on, what we're going to do is open up terminal and just commit this code to Git, which is our source control. So let's cd into the project, and if we do the git status, you'll see here are the new files, here are the things that have changed. We want to do a git add, do a git status again. Again, to clear out the text in here, you can do a command K, and we want to commit this and say handle auth session add database, and we can push this to GitHub, which I set up already. And you'll see if we do a git push, it's pushing it, and it has written it to GitHub. And looks like this has reset. I'm not sure if you guys can hear my computer fan being obnoxiously loud. Can't really do anything about it, but let's hit this run button again and see if our whole database hookup piece works. So here's our login screen. Should probably create an account first. And let's come on over here and let me create an account again for Joe Smith, joe@gmail.com, and password is password. Hit this, and looks like we crashed. So let's figure out what the heck we did wrong. So if we look at this stack trace, we can see that terminating due to invalid path validation, a child must be non-empty string and not contain these characters. Okay, that's fair. So our email contains those characters. So let's go ahead and pause this or stop this and go back to our database manager. So because our email is going to always have a dot and a @%, what we can do is we can update this email to string replace certain characters in that email. So we're gonna say safe email is email, and we wanna replace occurrences of the dot with a dash. I think dashes are allowed, right? Let's look at this again. So we can't have dots, we can't have pounds, dollars, and these brackets. So a dash should be good to go. So we're gonna replace that. And we are also going to replace replacing occurrences of the @ with a dash. And I don't think brackets are even allowed in email addresses, but we'll handle that if someone tells me in the comments they are. But now we're gonna check if this safe email is in the database. So the key is going to be the safe email. And now that we're checking the safe email, when we insert an email address to the database, we want to use this safe email again as well. So in this function, what we are going to do is get the safe email. And instead of doing it here directly, we can be a little smarter about it. And the way we're going to do that is by creating a computed property on here in this struct called safe email, which is simply going to return safe email. So what this will go ahead and do is it will take our email address property in here, do the string replace on it, and return that. And the benefit to that is now in here, we can just say user.safeemail. So every single place we use this struct, we are able to pull out the standard that we have defined for making the email safe. So let's try this one more time. Hit Command R to build and run. And let's cross our fingers, nothing crashes now. So let's come on over here to our form, and we're gonna say Joe Smith, joe@gmail.com, password, hit this, and it looks like we have successfully created an account. It has signed Joe in. If we hit Command R again, we should still be signed in, like that, beautiful. Let's go over here, and in our database, we can see that here is our safe email. If we open this up, here's our first name, here's our last name, and finally, if we head on over to Authentication, we also have a reference of this user to allow them to sign in. So let me go over here and let's delete the app to see if we can successfully sign in as well. We might need to reset the simulator again if the authentication session is still persisted, like that. So what we'll probably do in the next video is also add a sign out button or a logout button, because the simulator reset is going to get old really fast. So let's wait for that simulator to boot up again, and we'll just validate that login is still working, and then we'll call this video a conclusion of this video. Let's give it a second. So I've noticed resetting the simulator for me personally sometimes is super slow, and sometimes like what we just saw here, it's a little faster, or maybe I spoke too soon. There it goes. Let's hit Command R to build and run. And there is our app. And let's try to sign in with Joe. So joe@gmail.com and password. Hit this, and there we are. We are now signed in to our account for Joe. And let's just make sure when we reopen it, we're still signed in. So awesome, we still are. So there you have it. That's how we can flesh out our login register flow a little bit more. Again, we still have to do profile pictures and that stuff, but in the next 2 videos, we're gonna add Facebook login and Google login. This whole account creation is kind of antiquated, and to be honest, most people are lazy and will never do it in your real apps. So that said, if you haven't smashed that like button down below already, please make sure you do so for the YouTube algorithm. Helps me create more of these series and videos for all of you. While you're at it, hit subscribe if you like the content. Stay tuned. Comment if you have any issues or questions. Always love hearing from you all. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next part.